Hi everyone and welcome to CropsTV. My name is Erin Hodgson and I'm an entomologist at Iowa State University Extension and Outreach. And along with my co-author Ashley Dean, today we're going to be talking about alfalfa weevil management. So by the end of this video, I hope that you have a better understanding of how to identify alfalfa weevil and important parts of the life cycle, how to recognize plant injury and effective tips for sampling in alfalfa, and then finally giving you some management options for crop protection against this pest. So you may be surprised to know that weevils are the most common type of beetle. They're the most numerous family of beetles in the world. And weevils are herbivores, meaning they're plant feeders, and they have chewing mouthparts, just like all beetles do, and they have elbowed antennae. So what you're seeing in these photos are two different kinds of weevils with their mandibles and their maxillae at the tip of the snout. And you can see the elbowed antennae as well. And so some people mistake this snout for like a piercing sucking stylet with, say, like a true bug. But the chewing mouthparts are at the end, and you can have an elongated snout like the weevil on the left, or more of a blunt snout on the right. For alfalfa weevils, they are considered an invasive insect into North America, with the first detection in Utah in 1904. Over the next 100 years, they became widely dispersed throughout the United States and other parts of North America. And you can see they're in Iowa and considered a persistent pest, sometimes more of an economic concern in the more southern counties of the state. The adult weevil adults are about 1/4 inch in length and oval in shape. Like all weevils, they have clubbed antennae with a blunt snout, and I would consider them to have a brown body with golden or brown golden hairs, and they have a characteristic narrow dark stripe down the top of the back. They could be easily confused with another weevil that you're likely to see in alfalfa, which is the clover leaf weevil, except this weevil is about 3 times bigger than the alfalfa weevil, and it's less hairy, so it appears more smooth to me than alfalfa weevils. Now the larvae are also about 1/4 inch in length, and like all weevil larvae, they are legless, so they don't have the true legs or the prolegs that you could see with caterpillars. I think the larvae have wrinkled body in green color and a dark brown head capsule, or sometimes it can even be like a black in color. But they do have a characteristic white lengthwise stripe running down the top of the back. So this is a couple different photos showing alfalfa weevil on the left with the green wrinkled body, white stripe down the back, and black head capsule, as compared to the clover leaf weevil, which is about twice as big. It's 1/2 inch in length. It has a brown head and a white pinky stripe down the top of the body. So with these clues, hopefully you'll never mistake the clover leaf weevil for alfalfa weevil. Now, like all weevils and all beetles, they go through a complete life cycle, so 4 different life stages. And the alfalfa weevil has 1 generation per year, but it has a fairly staggered life cycle. And so instead of a really tight bell curve, it can be really strung out. And so you can have mixed ages where you have eggs, larvae, and adults all seen at the same time. Females lay eggs in stems, and they'll be eggs for approximately 2 weeks in the stem. And then the larvae hatch, and they'll go through 4 instars. And that could take about 3 to 4 weeks feeding as larvae before they pupate. Now the adults, once they emerge from the pupal resting stage, will feed for about 2 to 3 weeks. And in the summer, they take a break. They diapause in alfalfa crowns, or they could move within or around alfalfa fields, and they rest in high residue or sheltered areas. Now when temperatures start to cool off in the fall, they may resume activity and begin laying eggs. This is within alfalfa fields, but there's a high mortality rate of the eggs in Iowa. So not a lot of the eggs are going to survive. But if we have a mild winter, we definitely would have more survivorship of the eggs. And then the larval emergence in mild winters sometimes generates 2 larval peaks, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. Okay, so the second section is moving on to recognizing injury and giving you some scouting tips. Now when it comes to the adults, usually the feeding is minor. The adults can cause small circular cuts along leaf margins, and they like to be feeding in the lower canopy. If if the expanding terminals are not present, sometimes they'll scrape the top layer of the bark off after that first cutting. When and where to start looking for adults is looking for regrowth when the buds and the leaves start to generate or resume growth after a cutting or in the spring. And oftentimes they play dead, so they'll be falling from plants. They don't like to be disturbed, and if you see dead weevils in the crown, know that they're going to probably resume activity when you leave them alone. And so I recommend looking at 5 to 6 stems at 4 to 5 stops throughout each field. But of course, more sampling is better. I would recommend starting to scout for adults in May and early June, or around 3 to 5 days after the first cutting. And we had some really severe drought conditions in Iowa in 2021, and that can make the dry, hot weather have slow regrowth of some of those alfalfa fields. And so to know that if you have a lot of adults on slow regrowth, that can cause more injury or more severe injury in those seasons. When it comes to the larvae, remember they're going to be feeding first, and so really the first instars are smaller, of course, and they're going to be causing some pinholes on the terminal leaves. But the older the larvae get as they move through that fourth instar, they're going to be feeding more. They can skeletonize leaves and often leave the main veins behind on those trifoliates, and they, from a distance, really severe feeding can almost look like the field looks frosted or looks grayish in appearance. And so usually this type of frosted appearance peaks with that first cutting. And so the larvae can cause significant injury to crown stubble as well. And so even after the first cutting, if you have larvae present, they can be feeding within the stubble and also within the windrows. And with really high numbers like we saw in 2021, you can have decreased yield and growth. You can have delayed maturity or regrowth, and then reduced crude protein as well. So I want to give a shout out to Lance Scott, who is in Southwest Iowa, who showed me this video, an aerial video of alfalfa weevil injury. It's pretty severe in 2021. So you can see a lot of areas which are brown. They're having slow regrowth, and just a lot of patchy areas where it appears that the injury was pretty significant. So thanks, Lance. In order to confirm the weevil, sometimes you may have alfalfa weevil and cloverleaf weevil feeding at the same time. And really only alfalfa weevil would be considered an economic pest. They tend to be feeding on the new growth at the top of the plant. They also don't like to be disturbed like the adults, and so they're going to curl up and try and seek refuge when they sense that you're walking through the field. Now, cloverleaf weevils prefer feeding at the base of the plant. And remember, they're going to be approximately twice as big as alfalfa weevil. And so in order to confirm activity with this pest, I really recommend using a sweep net in alfalfa. But because they tend to curl up and play dead and seek out refuge, you really have to sweep hard, harder than you would, say, if you're sweeping in soybean, because you want to dislodge the larvae that are feeding on the plant. And almost always you're going to find mixed ages, so you're going to be finding 1st through 4 instars in that sweep net. And then just alfalfa is a great crop for hosting a lot of different insects. It supports lygus bugs, a couple different species of aphids, flea beetles, caterpillars, and so much more. So usually when you sweep, you're going to find a lot of different things. Doesn't necessarily mean that they're of economic importance, but it is important to know when you have alfalfa weevils that are small and when they're a little bit bigger. I talked about using a sweep net to sample for larvae in the season, but it does take some experience and some practice to become an effective sweeper. And so I'm going to take a short break and insert this video to give you some tips and tricks to becoming a more accurate sweeper. So here we go. Today is just a short video on explaining some quick tips for using sweep nets to assess insect population in field crops. Okay, one of the first things that I think about if you're new to sweeping is getting a heavy-duty sweep net with a muslin cloth type net instead of the mesh because it won't hold up very long. So you can find those at a couple different places like Gempler's or through BioQuip, a few other online resources, but make sure you get a nice sturdy net, and I would highly recommend getting an extra net to go along with the frame. Second point is sweep nets only work in certain crops or work effectively in certain crops. So alfalfa, soybean, and small grains probably work the best for using a sweep net. You have to wait until plants are about 8 to 10 inches tall before you are able to use a sweep net, and that's just because the net has to hit the plant, and so you have to wait till they get a little bit taller later in the season. The purpose of a sweep net is to dislodge the insects that are on the plant. And so in order to do that, you have to hit the foliage to dislodge the insects, and hopefully they'll fall into the net. So you want to use a bit of force because you are trying to get them to come off the plant and be collected inside the net. If I never have any plant material, I may not be sweeping low enough or hard enough to dislodge those insects. Another good point for those that are new to sweeping is take big steps. You want to cover approximately 3 linear feet as you are walking forward. So of course this is easier to do if you're taller, but you're trying to sample new foliage as you're walking along. Depending on the crop or in time of year, you may be able to use a pendulum type sweep net approach where you're sweeping 2 rows with one sweep as the net is swung in front of you, like as Ashley Dean is demonstrating here. So this is easier said than done when crops are small or when the canopy hasn't closed yet. But basically one swing across the front of you will cover 2 rows. And again, you're walking quickly and you're taking big steps as you go along. If you have stands that are like alfalfa or small grains where it's hard to sweep in front of you because of all the foliage, you could try sweeping on the side of your body with a back to forward motion, and you're sweeping approximately 3 linear feet as you walk along. Ideally, you would take 10 sweeps per stop, and depending on the size and shape of the field and how much time you have, you may stop at 10 different spots in the field to assess activity. Now notice here when Ashley is wrapping up her 10th sweep, she has one more sweep in the air where it helps push down all the insects that are in the net. This can help, especially for mobile insects, so they won't jump out or fly out at you when you do your assessments. If you're trying to assess activity right in the field, you can push the bottom of the net closer to the top of the ring and count your insects that way. If you want to be really particular, or you're looking for a couple different species at one time, sometimes you'll be able to push this into a gallon Ziploc bag and either freeze it, look at it later, or you'd be able to sit down and go through things a little bit more carefully if you put all your samples in bags. I hope this video was helpful to you, and good luck this season. Thanks. When to start scouting for larvae is important, and I would focus my efforts on the most profitable areas of the farm, the most valuable crops of alfalfa, and then south and west facing slopes because they're going to warm up faster and resume growth and larval activity faster than other parts of the field. I would focus on the top of the plant for newly expanding leaves, and again, using a sweep net is going to be your best tool for first detection if those larvae are there or not. And then if you want more detailed information, you can stop and count larvae on 5 to 6 stems at 4 to 5 stops. Now, when to start scouting, it really depends on accumulating heat units or degree days. And of course, like plants, they need heat units to develop, so do insects as well. So in April and May, my recommendation for scouting, if you're south of I-80, is to begin scouting at 200 degree days with a base of 48 degrees. And then if you're above I-80, is to begin scouting at 250 degree days. Degree days are important. As I mentioned, plants, they have stand regrowth depending on temperature, so accumulating heat units. Also things that influence the growth are soil moisture, texture, stand age, and cultivar selection. There's a lot of different things that influence how fast a plant can grow. And certainly the temperature and moisture or drought conditions we had in 2021 played a huge part on resuming growth. But then insects depend on temperature as well. And so I have 2 examples here showing why degree days matter. And I had a snapshot from the Mesonet at the agronomy department here at Iowa State showing degree day accumulations for April 15th in 2012 on the left, and then on April 15th in 2021. Now remember, I said for southern part of Iowa, we want to start scouting at 200-degree days. And for northern, it's 250-degree days. And so you can see in 2012, if you remember, it was a really warm spring. We've already blown way past those recommendations. And so if you waited to scout until April 15th, likely you've already missed the initial movement or resuming activity of alfalfa weevil in the field. Now, that's compared to April of 2021. We haven't quite hit those thresholds in the southern or northern counties, and it was a little bit of a cooler spring. But if you are trying to target your sampling efforts, maybe you have a lot of different things going on the farm. If it's a cooler spring, the larvae are going to resume growth and development a little bit slower after egg hatch. Now, earlier I talked about two larval peaks that could be forming with alfalfa weevil, and this is a really interesting concept from an entomology point of view, but it makes management and scouting and management more difficult. And so for those weevils that lay eggs in the fall and those eggs survive the winter, of course those larvae are going to hatch sooner, and the peak activity of those fall laid eggs is around 325-degree days. Now, for those weevils that lay eggs in the spring, those larvae are going to peak around 575-degree days, so a little bit later in the season. So what was especially interesting in 2021 is the larval activity extended past that first cutting and were still a problem for people during that second cutting. Well, by that time, people were also having issues with potato leafhopper and pea aphids, and then you just get a lot of other insects and other things going on in alfalfa. So normally when people just think about alfalfa weevil as a first cutting problem, this year seemed to be a little bit different. So I'm not sure what that means for 2022 and beyond, but to know that the larval activity seems to be expanding, and again, instead of a tight bell curve, it seems to be a little bit more strung out. Okay, so we're going to be talking about some management options for alfalfa weevil and alfalfa. And there are really a lot of different things that we can do to be proactive, hopefully doing a couple different things to make those fields seem less attractive and therefore less successful for alfalfa weevil. So I'll just touch upon a couple of these different tactics. And the first one is really largely out of our hands, and we're relying on natural enemies, sometimes referred to as biological control, with predators, pathogens, and parasitoids. We have a large number of predators, including beetles, flies, true bugs, other things, lacewings, that have basically a wide host preference. They'll eat anything that they can find. And so that's in alfalfa, corn, soybean, throughout the landscape of Iowa. And when it comes to the parasitoids or the wasps of those that attack specifically alfalfa weevil, there have been 8 different species released by the USDA that specifically attack the larvae. And in some of the more western states, the Intermountain West, you can see a 35% reduction strictly by the parasitoids that are released and now have become established out west. We haven't really seen that level or that reduction here in the Midwest. And then there's just a lot of naturally occurring entomopathogens or insect-killing fungi that are naturally occurring in the soil. And they attack a number of species attack the larvae as well. And so instead of that wrinkly green larvae that we see normally, those infected larvae turn brown and die very quickly. And the fungi particularly are favored by warm and humid environments. And so when it comes to natural enemies, of course, we can't rely on having predators and parasitoids and have very frequent exposures of synthetic insecticides. And so we can't have both of them and expect both to do a good job. And so in order to have more natural control, we have to leave some untreated areas of standing alfalfa or have access to blooming flowers on field borders. And so this is easier said than done, I understand that, but to leave access to blooming plants is what is going to draw in the adults. Hopefully they'll spend time eating, mating, and laying eggs, and leaving offspring behind that become predators during the growing season. So if that's at all possible, encouraging blooming plants is going to be great for predators, but also parasitoids and pollinators in that area. And if you're familiar with Alison Robertson, she often talks about the disease triangle, and that you need the susceptible host and the pathogen and favorable environment for the disease to become activated. And so oftentimes those windrows can set up the conditions for a triangle and fungal outbreaks. And so in that windrow, you can have a lot of larvae and adults that are trying to survive in there, but if conditions are favorable, especially hot and humid, you can have fungal outbreaks. So it is important to know what alfalfa weevil looks like in comparison to other pests, but to know when they start to look a little off. Probably the most effective thing that we could do for alfalfa weevil control is mechanical control, and it is the highly preferred method. And it can reduce activity of 90% or more, and the action of raking post-harvest stubble can further cause mortality or injury to the larvae. And then simply mechanical control basically induces starvation, desiccation, and sometimes it's simply enough for UV exposure to cause mortality of alfalfa weevil larvae. If you're not familiar with the Iowa State University predictive equations of alfalfa quality, I really encourage you to become familiar with this estimate. And at the end of the day, it provides relative feed value for alfalfa plus harvest losses that you can expect based on things like plant height and the stage of the plant. So there's a website there for you to become more familiar. It's another leadership team called the dairy team that works with the ISU peak, and so I encourage you to become familiar with that. So to understand if a cutting is at the relative feed value that meets the goals of your farm. So in addition to cutting, just grazing in the winter and spring can be effective suppression techniques. And so the cows are actually going to eat or crush the eggs, which is great, or they could eat the larvae or the adults depending on the time that you have cows out there. In some states in the Intermountain West, they use intercropping fairly effectively to reduce weevil numbers. And then I haven't seen anything here with rollers or flaming, but it is more commonly practiced out in the West as a way to cause mortality of the larvae and the adults. But if appropriate and practical, if you have animals on the farm, grazing can also be a great cultural tool to reduce weevil numbers. And then lastly, I would consider chemical control a last resort, especially when it comes to a crop like alfalfa, because we do have the opportunity for mechanical control. And treatment decisions should be based on either alfalfa densities or injuries. So either the amount of larvae that you see or the amount of injured plants. Now there are a lot of insecticide options labeled for alfalfa weevil in alfalfa, so you just want to make sure that when you're reading labels you see specifically alfalfa weevils on there. Now some of these treatments can be fairly expensive, not only the product themselves but the application costs, especially if you don't own your own equipment and you have to rent it out. And so to know that not every application is going to be a break-even decision and may not actually be a profitable one. So to take in consideration the purpose of the crop, the market value, and also the control costs of taking action that day, especially if mechanical control isn't an option. I've heard about reports in 2021 where we had resurgence of other pests after trying to manage alfalfa weevils. And so this is something that happens fairly frequently, and especially a crop like alfalfa that supports a lot of pest activity. And so when fields were treated for alfalfa weevil, we had some resurgence of potato leafhoppers and some pea aphids. And especially in some counties in the north central, northeastern part of the state, pea aphids were particularly difficult to control. And so it's unknown if the pea aphid is resistant to pyrethroids, but they did seem like they were very difficult to manage in 2021. So more details to come about that. But to know that in some parts of the western U.S., resistance to pyrethroids for alfalfa weevil has been confirmed. They would consider the resistance to be highly localized because the weevils don't move long distance during their life, so the problem has been mostly a field-by-field situation. But to know that if we rely on pyrethroids, especially multiple exposures in a single growing season, we could end up with resistance to pyrethroids for alfalfa weevil, and that would be that would be really unfortunate for us to have in Iowa. So again, if you're looking at the label, remember the label is the law. We also in Iowa have the B rule, which really discourages applications made to plants that are in bloom. And so to target sprays at dawn and dusk. And actually this is a good fit for alfalfa weevil because that is when they tend to be most active and the chance of contact with that application is higher. So during the peak of the day they can seek out refuge in cracks and crevices or be in the crown. So we want to have maximum exposure. So it's really important for alfalfa to note the pre-harvest interval, and especially if you're trying to time your cuttings for relative feed values. And so if you happen to be feeding or grazing that area to animals, you also want to look at the label for particular notes about that too. And so you want to look at how many applications you could make in a year, then the rate of application, especially if you're dividing it up. But we would really encourage you not to use the same product multiple times over the season, but to really mix it up the best that you can. If cutting isn't an option, say you're in between cuttings, you're noticing, especially in that second cutting, alfalfa weevil still seems to have a lot of small instars and a lot of feeding left to go, and you're concerned about the quality or the quantity of that field, an economic threshold has been developed in order to help make profitable treatment decisions. And so if cutting isn't an option, you're looking at the number of injured terminals, or you're counting larvae. So for example, injured terminals could be 30 to 50% are injured by larvae, or that you have 1.5 to 3 larvae per stem, or if you're sweeping, it would be 20 per sweep. In those conditions that are very hot and dry and severe drought, as I mentioned earlier, some of the stubble can have a hard time greening up. And so in that case, if we happen to be in drought stress, you could even look at 8 larvae plus adults per square foot. And so you'd want to use these guidelines in order to estimate either injury or activity before making treatment decisions. And I think that'll increase the odds of breaking even or making profitable treatment decisions. So some take-home points from today is that alfalfa weevil is a persistent pest. It has a good chance of overwintering in Iowa, although the eggs don't tend to overwinter very well. The adults do. And so it did seem to be one of the most frequent pests I heard about in 2021. And I would expect in 2022 and beyond that we're going to see more alfalfa weevils. And so frequent sampling, especially during the first cutting, is really necessary. We saw an extended feeding period where we had mixed larvae feeding still within the second cutting. They seem to go on forever, and so it is something to look out for is after that first cutting, if you still see a lot of larvae feeding, we may need to take some action either with harvest if it's timely and the relative feed value is that what you're looking for, or as a last resort, insecticides. So it's not hard to find me. I'm going to be talking about estimated scouting intervals, some options for insecticide control, and if I'm noting the same type of activity of a kind of extended larval activity like we saw in 2021. And I'm going to be posting those updates on Twitter and also in our ICM News and ICM blog on our website. So I appreciate you guys watching my video, and good luck in 2022.